appraiser stood at the edge of the old gravel pit with his clipboard out and his boots already half covered in dust. It was late April 1986, northern Missouri. The wind was still cutting across the open pasture, and the sky had that flat white color it gets before planting. His name was Carroll Fenn. He had been doing agricultural appraisals in Grundy and Lynn counties for 14 years, and he knew the difference between productive ground and the other kind. Below him, the pit dropped away from the fence line, about 150 feet across and 30 feet deep at the center. Willow brush had taken the northwest bank. A cattail fringe ran along the south end. The east face was a raw cut of gravel and sand layered like a diagram, pale gray over tan, the kind of wound a piece of ground doesn't heal from. The water at the bottom was green-gray and still, holding the flat sky and making it look dirtier than it was. An old fence post leaned toward the water at an angle nobody had bothered to fix. It did not look like a pond. A pond looks planned. This looked like somebody had taken what they wanted and left the farm to live around the hole. Carroll wrote without looking up, "Abandoned gravel pit, non-productive, hazard." Ray Holloway stood on the bank above him. He was 46. He had run cattle on this ground since 1979, 47 black baldy cows, and a note at the Trenton Bank that needed renewing every spring, and he had not asked for the appraisal. The bank had required it. Ray said, "So you don't count it?" Carroll said, "I count it against you. 3.5 acres out of your grazing acreage, and I have to note the hazard. A cow goes down that bank, you have a dead cow and a liability." From the fence line on the county road, Harold Bean was leaning on his truck bed. He farmed the 80 to the west and had known Ray since high school. Harold called over, "Only thing that hole grows is mosquitoes." Carroll closed the clipboard. He said it the way a man says something he's said 40 times that month. "It's not personal, Ray. A hole is not an asset." He drove back to Trenton to file it. Ray stayed and looked down into the water a while longer. The appraiser was right about one thing. The pit was not pasture. Ray just did not think pasture was the only way water could pay. At the feed store that Saturday, the story had already made the rounds. Ray Holloway still hadn't filled the gravel pit. The bank had it marked a hazard. He was going around saying the water in it was clean. Nobody said it to be cruel. They said it because the pit really was dangerous, and because a hole in the ground had never once in the history of Grundy County paid a feed bill. Cows can't graze gravel. A hole is not an asset. That pit takes acres and gives weeds. Clean water, in that mosquito bowl, if it was worth anything, the county would have kept it. He's trying to borrow against a road scar. Ray heard all of it and said nothing back. He had 47 cows to feed, 2 shallow ponds that were already dropping before summer even started, and a creek that turned to coffee every time it rained more than an inch. He didn't have time to defend a hole in the ground to men who were, as far as anybody could prove that April, entirely correct. The county had cut the pit for road rock back in the 1950s. Ray's father had worked the road crew himself for a stretch and had taken the county's payment and farmed around the scar for the next 25 years without finding much use for it. He used to say the pit never went dry, but it never made a crop either. He'd said one other thing. The single time young Ray had asked him why the pit cleared up after a storm while the creek stayed muddy for days. Mud runs fast. Gravel makes water slow down. Ray had filed that away the way a kid files away something that sounds like it should mean something, and turns out, 30 years later, to mean exactly what it said. He started paying attention to it in the spring of 1985, after a wet April pushed the creek out of its banks and kept it running brown for 4 days. He was checking cattle water on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Creek still the color of coffee. Both ponds still chocolate from the runoff, and he walked to the northwest corner out of habit more than anything. The pit wasn't clear. It had come up muddy in the storm, same as everything else, the banks slumping a little at the waterline, silt riding the surface. But at the north end, where the gravel seam showed in the bank face, and where he'd always noticed a chill in the water, even in August, the surface had cleared enough that he could see pale gravel 3 feet down. The creek wouldn't clear for another day and a half. He knelt at the north bank and put his hand in, cold, colder than the pond by a lot. He wrote in the notebook he kept in the truck, "Pit clears before creek, north edge cold, do not let cows in, pump from top." That was the thesis he didn't know he had yet. The gravel pit was not worthless. It had been judged as land, when its value was water. He didn't know what to do with that yet either. He put the notebook back in the glove box and went back to work. The loan officer, a man named Art Moline, who'd handled Ray's operating note for 6 years, called in June after the appraisal came back. The pit notation was a problem, not fatal, but a problem. The northwest pasture acreage was getting discounted because of the adjacent hazard, and the collateral had come in $8, $400 lower than the year before. Art said the fix was simple: fill the pit or fence it properly and submit a revised appraisal. Ray called a dozer contractor in Chillicothe. Grading and filling it out to kill the hazard classification would run $4,400 to $5,500 before fence repair. He called Art back and said he didn't have $4,400. Art said the note could still renew at the reduced collateral, just at a worse rate. Ray thanked him and hung up, and went and stood at the north bank again and looked at the water a long time. He tried to prove something with it that fall. He borrowed a small centrifugal trash pump from his brother-in-law, a 2-inch intake, 70 gallons a minute when it was primed and behaving. He built a rough platform out of treated lumber set back from the edge, ran an intake hose weighted below the waterline with a hardware cloth screen over the end, and strung new 4-strand barbed wire tight along the worst of the steep bank with 2 new posts driven for good measure. He set a beat-up 100-gallon stock tank on solid ground behind the fence. It failed in almost every way a small try can fail. The pump lost prime twice. The hose collapsed where it bent over the bank lip. The screen clogged with willow leaves inside 20 minutes. What came through had grit in it, fine sand that settled on the tank bottom, and the tank grew a film of algae in 3 days sitting in the sun with no shade over it. A heifer that always tested fence got her front feet over the wire while Ray was fussing with the pump and came within a slide of going down the bank before she scrambled back, mud to her knees. His wife came out and looked at the mud on the calf and said, "If one of those gets down that bank, we'll lose it. That hole will cost you more than it saves." His brother-in-law came to collect his pump and said the intake was set too low. "You're sucking mud, not water." Harold drove by, stopped, and watched Ray pull the clogged screen for the second time that afternoon. "You'll spend more keeping cows out of that hole than you'll ever get from it." Ray didn't argue. The tank was half full of sandy water the cows wouldn't touch because the pond that week was still good enough. He drained it and hauled the pump back to the shed and went inside and did math on a yellow legal pad. Because the bank liked math, and because he liked to see numbers even when they weren't good yet. 47 cows and their calves needed something like 1,000 to 1,100 gallons a day in summer heat. Once he'd worked in the waste, a stock tank always loses to spillage and evaporation. Not the textbook 10 gallons a head they printed for winter. 15 to 20 a head when it was hot and they were walking to water and back. Hauling it, at $48 a day for a truck and a 500-gallon tank, 3 weeks would run just over $1,000. A bad flood year, 3 weeks could stretch to 5, and the number climbed past 1,600, not counting the days he wouldn't be fixing fence or putting up hay because he'd be on the road to Trenton and back instead. A pit setup done right, pump, screen, hose fence, tank, gravel pad, priced out around $1,100 to $1,170, most of it wire and a used tank. Filling the whole thing in, dozer and fence and grading, ran $4,400 to $5,500 and left him with 3.5 acres of rough ground that might, if it rained right, eventually grow fescue. Either way, he was buying something. The question was which purchase actually solved the problem in front of him. The pit did not write Ray a check. It stopped the water truck from writing one every morning. But he couldn't make that argument to a bank with a clogged screen and a calf covered in mud to show for it. Carol had been right about one thing. The pit was not pasture. Ray just didn't think pasture was the only way water could pay. He put the pad in the drawer and went back to work. The flood came in late May of 1986. It wasn't billed as historic. It was a slow-moving system that stalled over northern Missouri and sat there through Wednesday and most of Thursday. The gauge at the Trenton airport caught 5.8 inches in 40 hours. Ray's own gauge, a plastic cylinder he read every morning, showed 6.1. The creek came over its banks Wednesday morning and spread brown water across the low hay ground. By afternoon, the two farm ponds had merged with the flood entirely. One sheet of chocolate-colored water across the bottom that Ray watched from the barn door. He'd moved the herd to the North Ridge Tuesday night as soon as the forecast turned certain. The barn lot well kept them fine for now. It was the pasture water he was thinking about. The ponds the herd would need once the high ground ran short, and the creek that would run muddy for the better part of a week. Harold backed his own truck and a 500-gallon tank down the county road twice that first day, tires caked, hauling from the water station in Trenton at $48 a trip. Ray walked to the pit Thursday morning while the rain was still falling. It had come up muddy, same as everything, gray-brown at the top, gravel invisible. He walked back to the barn. Friday morning, with the rain stopped and the creek beginning its slow retreat, he walked out again. The top layer was still muddy, but at the north end, at the base of the exposed gravel face, something had started, not clear, not what he'd call clean, but different from the flat brown everywhere else. He pushed his hand in at 2 feet and felt the cold again. By Saturday, 30 hours after the rain quit, he could see gravel 4 inches under the north bank's surface. The creek was still the color of coffee. It would stay that color 2 more days. The county had taken gravel from the pit. What they left was a filter nobody had priced. Before he trusted it with cattle, he wanted to see it, not just feel it. He set 3 mason jars on a board across the tailgate, one filled from the creek, still brown as it had been all week, one from the pond, thick and chocolate with silt, one dipped from the pit's north edge, cloudy at the top, but with a visible line of gravel sediment already dropping toward the bottom of the glass. It wasn't a laboratory. It was 3 jars on a board, but one of them was clearing while the other 2 stayed brown. And that told him more than an opinion would have. He set the pump Saturday morning, this time with what he'd learned. The intake hung from a float made out of an old plastic jug, 6 inches under the surface and well above the mud. He weighted the hose with a piece of rebar so it wouldn't drift, and ahead of the stock tank he ran the water through a cut-down 55-gallon drum, screened, that let it sit 20 minutes before it moved on. Whatever the gravel hadn't caught, the barrel would. He primed it. The water came through gray-tinged, then lighter as the surface silt worked out of the system. After 15 minutes it was pale instead of gray. After 30 it wasn't clear, but it was usable. He filled the tank with the first 200 gallons and let it sit 2 hours before he moved 6 cows down to the fenced ground above the pit. They found the tank in 20 minutes. They drank. He was not letting the cattle anywhere near the pit itself. The bank was steep and unstable after the flood, and a cow that went down, it wasn't coming back up without a tractor and a lot of luck. He wasn't pumping the brown top layer either. Only the cold seep at the north edge, and only into the barrel first. He didn't use any of it for the house. The pump ran 2 hours morning, 2 hours evening for the next stretch of days. The complications came the way complications always come, one at a time, none of them the one he'd planned for. Day 3, the intake screen clogged with willow leaves the storm had blown in. He pulled it, cleared it, wired a bigger cage of hardware cloth around it, and cut the clogging down to once every couple of days. Day 5, the water in the barrel had a faint sulfur smell he didn't like. He drove a sample to the extension office in Trenton. The agent, Carl Dunlap, said it was likely organic material stirred up by the flood, not necessarily contamination, and told him to drain the barrel completely and refill it fresh every 2 days instead of running it continuous. Dunlap didn't bless the setup. He told Ray what not to do. Don't pump the brown top layer. Don't let cattle stand on the bank. Don't use any of it for the house. Let the silt settle before it goes near a trough. Keep pulling from the cold edge as long as it keeps clearing, and the day it stops clearing, stop pulling. It wasn't a certification. It was a short list of rules from a man who'd seen more floodwater than Ray had. Ray followed it. The smell backed off. Day 7. Harold stopped his truck at the fence and watched the cattle at the tank a long moment. "Are they drinking that?" he said. Ray said they were. "How long before you get them sick?" Ray said he'd run a sample. Counties telling people to boil their household water. This is for stock, not the house. Harold said he was hauling 500 gallons a day from the Trenton station at $48 a trip, and one load didn't always cover his herd. On the hottest days, he'd had to make the run twice. He drove on without another word about mosquitoes. Day 9. 6 feet of the north bank slumped 2 feet closer to the water. Ray moved the pump platform back, reset the intake angle, drove 2 posts, and strung a rope he could hold if he had to get close to the edge. He told his boy not to go near the pit without calling him first. Day 13. The settling barrel cracked at a weld. He patched it with roofing tar and ran the pump light while it cured. One day, a south wind pushed surface turbidity right into the north intake, and he wasn't willing to pull from it. He hauled that day, partial load, and waited it out. The cattle drank through all of it and didn't scour and didn't lose the condition. Harold's did the week his had no choice but the creek. He checked the numbers on the evening of the 19th day. He'd watered 47 cows and 41 calves off the pit tank for most of that stretch. He'd hauled on 3 days, the clog, the barrel crack, the bad wind, at $48 a trip, sometimes 2 trips. Call it around $300 in hauling he still had to eat. The pit setup, start to finish, had cost just over $1,000. The hauling it avoided, over the 17 days the pump actually ran, came to somewhere north of $1,600. Net difference, about $619. That's not a fortune. It didn't read like one on the legal pad either. But his operating account had under $2,000 in it at the start of the flood, and between fence repairs and hay, he couldn't get off wet ground and the odds and ends the storm cost him. That number had already thinned out before the fall calf check was anywhere in sight. Hauling every day instead of pumping would have put him in the negative before September. He wasn't in the negative. He was positive, barely, and the calf check was 4 months out. The pit did not make Ray rich. It kept him from spending money he did not have. The creek cleared on the 22nd day. The ponds were silty but usable by the end of June. Ray ran the pump 17 days total, then pulled it and stored it in the barn. In September, he drove to Trenton and set a folder on Art Molling's desk: pump receipts, fence receipts, the tank receipt, Carl Dunlap's water quality note from the extension office, a daily log of gallons pumped and cattle watered. 3 dated photographs off the north bank, showing the water clearing by degrees as the flood went down. Art looked at the log. 47 cows for 17 days out of the gravel pit? 47 cows and 41 calves, Ray said. Art called Carol Fenn the following week and asked him to take a second look at the northwest corner. Carol came out in October. He walked the bank with Ray. He looked at the pump platform, the fence, the tank, the settling barrel, and the log. He crossed out what he'd written in April: abandoned gravel pit, nonproductive, hazard. He wrote instead, fenced gravel pit with controlled stock water access, functions as emergency water reserve in high water events. Contributory value to adjacent pasture restored, subject to maintained fencing and pump access. "I still can't call it pasture," he said. "I'm not asking you to," Ray said. Carol looked at the cattle on the hill, in decent shape for a flood year. "But it supports pasture," he said. "That's what it did," Ray said. The $8,400 discount came off the appraisal. The note renewed at the standard rate. Harold Bean came by a week later and stood at the fence. No jokes this time. He looked at the tank, the barrels, the pump under a tarp on a pallet. "How long did it take to clear?" he said. "About a day and a half at the north edge." Harold said he had an old quarry pond on his south place the county had dug for culvert stone back in the 60s that he'd spent 20 years fencing cattle away from. He asked if Ray figured it would do the same thing. "Walk it after a flood," Ray said. "Not before. See where it clears first. And don't let cows in. Pump from the top." Harold nodded. "That water you had them on wasn't pretty, was better than what I was hauling." "Gravel slows water down," Ray said. "I'll remember that," Harold said and drove back down the road. The gravel pit was still ugly in October. It hadn't changed shape or size. It still took 3.5 acres nobody could plow or graze outright. It still needed permanent fence. It could still drown a cow if Ray got careless with it. The bank had not been wrong to call it a hazard. It had been wrong to call it only a hazard. The county had dug the gravel out and left a scar behind, and the only question anybody had ever asked about it was what it could grow. The answer to that was nothing. Nobody had asked what it could filter. Nobody had asked why the north edge cleared before the creek did, or whether a gravel seam that moved water slow was worth something a creek bed moving water fast was not. Ray had asked those questions. He hadn't found a dramatic answer. He'd found a pump, a settling barrel, a stock tank, and 17 days of usable water for 47 cows when the creek and the ponds weren't fit to drink. The county had seen a hole, the bank had seen waste, the neighbor had seen mosquitoes. Ray had watched where the water cleared first. After the flood, that was the only difference that mattered. Would you fence and pump from an old gravel pit after a flood, or haul water from town at $48 a trip?